All right, now we're joined by Reuven Carlyle, who's running for re-election to Washington State Senate. So go ahead with a 2-minute introduction.
Thank you very much. Appreciate this, and I think it's fabulous that you put this online and allow people to really engage in thoughtful discussion of the real deal issues. I've had the great honor of serving in the State Senate for 2 years and in the House prior to that for 7 years. I am deeply inspired and motivated by systems issues, really tough structural challenges. Climate change, tax reform, healthcare, education, real issues that go to the core of how we build quality of life. This last couple of years, I've had the great honor since the Democrats took over the State Senate this last year to serve as chair of the Energy, Environment, and Technology Committee, which has a wide purview of work associated with the Senate. And I'm very proud that this year we passed a carbon pricing bill. It was the first time in U.S. history that any state legislature or any committee has passed a major carbon pricing bill, not just a cap and trade system in history. For most of the years that I've been in Olympia, I've been the prime sponsor of the bill to eliminate the death penalty. And I'm very proud that for the first time in history, we got the bill out of not only the state Senate, but we did it with 5 Republican votes, so very bipartisan. I worked that very hard in partnership with a whole bunch of other folks, hoping to get that next time. Third, a deep passion of mine for all of my service has been foster youth. And I've worked very hard to improve the educational outcomes. When I joined the legislature, the high school graduation rate of foster youth was about 27% in the state. It's now about 49 to 50%, so we've almost doubled it. I'm very proud of that. That's been a lot of the work that I've focused on. A number of other issues are driven by tax transparency, opening up the books. We have more than 700 tax preferences in this state, and I've passed some sweeping legislation to open up those books in terms of public transparency. So I'm very focused on leading the Senate Energy, Environment, and Technology Committee this coming year. I'm also very proud that we passed legislation around net neutrality at the state level, first time in history. So many efforts like that. Proud to be partner in representing not only our district, but statewide.
All right, thank you. So now we have our 4 prepared questions that we're asking all candidates for legislature. You're welcome to turn it over and read along as we read them aloud. So 2-minute answers. And Jason, will you do number 1?
What tax reforms are realistic in the next legislation session to address Washington State Regressive Tax Code? And what is your suggested strategy for achieving them? Longer term, what in your mind is the ideal tax structure for Washington State?
So my focus has overwhelmingly been on the issue of transparency. Those tax preferences have been secret up until a few years ago. I passed sweeping legislation that requires that all new tax preferences or that get reclassified as a tax preference, the value of that tax preference has to be public information. And that has really changed how we look at tax preferences in Olympia. And I think opening the books is an important step. I think we're not done with that. We have a huge amount of work to continue to do on that. I also have worked and have not made much progress yet, but I've worked hard to aggregate the data around how much taxes are actually paid. So as a specific example, we have 5 refineries in the state. The oil industry pays about $16.5 billion of Washington State revenue, those 5 refineries. They pay $199 million in all taxes combined. Of that $199 million, $102 million of it is MODCA, so the oil cleanup fund. $97 million is business and occupation, sales, and excise taxes. So just by being open about that kind of data, which no one in the past had ever done, I think we're transforming how we look at our tax policy. The ideal tax structure is low rates, broadly applied with few exemptions. What we have is categorically the opposite, high rates, narrowly applied with hundreds of exemptions. We have to recognize that structural. That goes to the core of the inequity, the core of the regressivity, and the core of the economic inefficiency where you inherently are in the business of picking winners and losers. And that means the lobbyists have disproportionate power. One of the most remaining egregious tax preferences we have is for the prescription warehousing companies. just today were raked over the coals by the Republican Congress associated with the opioid epidemic. We grant them a double secret probation tax preference. So I'd like to continue to make progress in this important area.
Great. Sophia, number 2.
What can and will you do in the legislature to help cities like Seattle address the related crises of homelessness and high housing costs?
That's a great question. So I was a few minutes late because I was literally just on the phone with the mayor about this exact question. I will say that it is very important to recognize that Seattle is feeling this enormous pressure associated with the head tax and this enormous pressure around homelessness, in part because they're downstream from the fact that a lot of the cities in the region and a lot of the counties and the state are not being a proportional partner. The state has categorically failed in the area of mental health support services. And I don't mean just Western State and the other institutions. I mean community-based programs, and I mean the transition from inpatient to outpatient, and I also mean the opioid and other drug issues. The state has really failed on many levels. From a funding point of view, the state has failed to have sort of a proportional revenue share associated with the real impacts of mental health and opioids and other issues. And I think that is what is increasing the pressure on the city of Seattle. And then finally, I think on housing affordability, some of the real progress on transit-oriented development has been very constructive. I'd like to see us double down on that. I also know that there are some companies that are very interested in workforce development, such as the hospitals and others, so that they can help their workers have affordable housing. And I think we ought to look at some tax policy associated with that kind of creative investments.
Great. Nicole, number 3.
Says, many community members and transit supporters are proposing a west of the 15th tunnel alignment for rail to Ballard. Sound Transit has indicated they will need additional funding to make this possible. Is this something you would support? More broadly, do you support finding new revenues to accelerate ST3 project delivery?
So this past year, the legislature faced a choice relative to modifying the CARTAB apportionment or allocation model per vehicle. I apologize. And I voted against that. I did not feel like that was appropriate. The public voted for it, and I think primarily in an era of uncertainty relative to federal dollars, we have to be particularly cautious, and things have fundamentally changed since that vote relative to the federal government partnership. So I have very much been supportive of protecting Sound Transit's funding. In terms of the 15th, I don't have a technical understanding of the implications of the true cost associated with that. I've had some initial discussions with Sound Transit as this issue has bubbled up, but I wouldn't say that I have a robust enough understanding about the true costs associated with it and what that would be. And then what would the financial implications be relative to what additional funding would be required. As I think people know, I was opposed to the financing package of Sound Transit because I believe that property taxes should be reserved for public education and for local government services, and it's the first time that we used property taxes for transit outside of the one city levy. It's the first time at the regional or state level. So I don't support the use of additional property taxes. I've been a strong opponent of that for both the McCleary funding as well as other sources. I think that we've really reached a tipping point where we're hurting affordability meaningfully. So I'm not in favor of that. We're the only source. But I'm very much open to us to continue to learn, continue to iterate, and see if a tunnel makes fiscal sense and makes policy sense. Then I'm very much open to that conversation of additional dollars if we can come to that table together. But again, I'm deeply cautious about any and would oppose any efforts associated with the property tax.
David, number 4.
Despite the passage of the recent education funding bills, Seattle Public Schools remain underfunded. What can and will you do to address this?
The state of Washington's investment in education associated with the McCleary lawsuit has been an ongoing challenge for many, many years. I do not believe we have fully funded education, as evidenced by the fact that we still face virtually every school in the 36th legislative district is packed from a capacity point of view. volume. So what we're missing in McCleary in large part is associated not just with operating costs, but with capital and the actual physical facilities of our schools, because we're limited. I would say that as the local levy goes down, I do think that cities like Seattle have a right to look at wraparound services, so the family and education levy that provides some of the really high value, high impact wraparound services around tutoring and mentoring add a lot of value. I think we should continue to look at that. I am concerned that with the state taking over the question of compensation from the locals, that you really have an affordability issue for teachers to actually continue to live in here, because we're constrained by that state level funding. And so I'm concerned about the model. I voted against the McCleary package. I voted against the property tax swap. I voted against the tax increase associated with that proposal, because I thought it was poorly constructed. So I have a deep reservation that a highly centralized top-down state system has the flexibility inherent to have the richness of diversity that Seattle has as 52,000 students, from a racial, from an economic, from a wraparound services point of view, our homeless population. So I'm concerned about our ability to meet local needs. I do support local flexibility. That's one of the reasons that I've been a strong opponent of a highly centralized state structured system. So I'm supportive of local flexibility. I would hope that we would look very critically at opportunities to enhance our local funding with the support of voters.
Great, so now we'll open it up to follow-up questions. These are 1-minute answers. People can ask whatever they want. We'll start with that.
Thanks for coming tonight. Will you publicly support universal health care by co-sponsoring Frog's bill next session?
I expect so, but I have not actually read it in a couple of years. He modified it materially about a year ago, and I have not looked at the final version, but the concept of universal health care, absolutely, and the concept of expanding the state's role relative to the role of insurance, absolutely. So conceptually, yes, but I have a responsibility to read the bill, and I have not done that, as it did change from a couple of years ago.
Thank you.
Additional questions? Yeah, Jason, and then David.
King County Court retention candidate, Ann Harper, was here on Monday, and she explained to us that every year every budget cycle, they have a budget cut. And so I'm not understanding how King County continues to grow and they're expected to do more with less. And I'm hoping that you're looking at that and addressing funding our court systems.
So two things. I think first and foremost, the courts, the county has a deep structural challenge. They're limited to the property tax as a revenue source. The property tax is limited in terms of growth, and they face a major structural challenges, and the courts are their primary obligation. They are an agent of the state, and the state has failed to provide the funding for that particular role. At the same time, with absolute due respect and deference, the county has numerous special purpose taxing districts and has chosen to offload those services into special purpose taxing districts in a way that makes it difficult to budget the general operating budget of the county. So it's very difficult structural. I question some of those policy decisions. And remember that the state legislature has granted special purpose taxing districts at the request of the counties primarily. So I think that there's a serious structural issue there. And then finally, the courts argue that they are a separate branch of government and that they shouldn't be under the oversight of the state relative to many other services like information technology, and so they don't share. So they spend probably 2 times what they should and get half the price, half the quality of product. So those are 3 structural issues that require a lot of work. I'm not minimizing them, but I think they go to the core of some of the challenges that the reality of judges and folks on the front lines face.
David.
You talk about transparency, and I, first of all, not a question, but a statement. What you're doing there is very important, and I'm very proud that my state senator is taking a leadership position in that regard. But I think there's another arena of transparency that state, local, county, nobody's paying attention to, and that's accountability. Why would I ever believe anything said by anybody who works for ST3 ever again, right? I realize that's not a legislative issue, but it's just the example that comes to mind. Every quarter I have to do a B&O tax, right? Our technology doesn't even remember where I left off last quarter, right? I used to have a tax accountant do it for me. Now I can kind of drill it down. But it could be so much. I'm not bitching about paying the tax, right? I'm bitching about how they have to make it so complex, right? And I'm just wondering, is there anybody on the legislative side, on the state side, that's saying, hey, let's be accountable for how we spend these tax dollars, regardless of the regressive way in which we're generating them? Who's holding them accountable? How's that happening or not happening?
I think that goes to the core of some of the disequilibrium that we feel today in civic discourse. There's a deep sense of suspicion, and there's concern that people aren't getting value for their dollar on some level. I would say that as chairman of the Energy, Environment, and Technology Committee, I have purview over technology. I had a meeting down in Olympia just a couple of days ago with the entire staff of all of the information technology projects for the state. They total a couple $100 million of programs that are underway right now. And we spend more than $1 billion a year, and I think that it is pretty close to a categorical failure relative to our lack of quality outcomes. We have state agencies that do 50, 60, 70, $100 million enterprise-wide systems. I have a technology background. I'm not an engineer, but I have a business background in this area. It's a major source of systems failure. And I think that goes to the core of visibility and transparency into what we do, and we need to do a better job, and it's an area of failure. And then finally, if I could, there is an area of transparency around our public records. It's a very controversial issue this last legislative session, and if I could answer that, I just think it's incredibly important, because if we don't have access to public records associated with our work in Olympia, I think the media suffers, and I think the public suffers, and I was one of the few members of the legislature to vote against that proposal, and I think it goes to the core of accountability.
Great. Ben, another one?
What will you be doing next session to secure more progressive taxation, like an income tax or capital gain tax in Washington State?
Well, I personally feel like we're at a historic time in terms of energy and environmental policy. I was the prime sponsor of the carbon pricing. For me, there is a nexus associated with carbon pricing. There are negative externalities to oil, and that's stormwater runoff, that's pollution of Puget Sound, that's killing salmon, it's killing orcas. There's all kinds of negative economic externalities to energy sources, fossil fuels associated with coal. So for me, an energy tax on pollution that taxes those negative externalities in order to mitigate those negative externalities has a direct nexus. So I have a personal passion around this issue. I do believe that a capital gains tax offers a lot of opportunities for progressivity, but I like the nexus associated with carbon pricing, because you get huge public policy values associated with that next generation of energy, as well as carbon reduction, as well as taxing a negative externality. So I have a personal drive to move forward on a carbon pricing mechanism, but I'm very much, of course, open to continuing to fight the battle for a much more progressive system.
We have time for one more. Jason?
King County passed a policy that we want to have a prepaid ballots, and there's some talk that we might need some more funding in that area. Do you have any comments about that?
There's been legislation for many years in the legislature. Senator Hasagawa, I believe, has been the leader of that. A lot of folks have been talking about this for many years. So I'm appreciative that our Secretary of State has recently discovered this issue. And I welcome to that public dialogue that's been going on by Democrats for many, many years. And I strongly support that. I think it increases representative democracy directly.
Great, so we are about out of time. If you want to take 30 seconds for a closing statement.
It is an incredible honor to represent the people of 36th District. We have the most educated, engaged, progressive, spirited district imaginable. This job is not quite as easy as people like to think, and it comes with particular challenges. I try to honor the opportunity to represent our district, to work on really deep structural, serious systems issues that need people to work on them. I'm not down there to throw around a press release. I'm down there to do really meaningful work, and I just really appreciate the honor. I think we're moving toward a moral and a just society in some ways, and we're retreating in other ways, failing in other ways, and I just hope that we can make meaningful progress, and I'm fired up to serve out a full term. I appreciate your
Thank you very
support.
much.